Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Um, you've already gotten a whiff of some of what we're going to be doing tonight. Gordon and I have known each other for 25 or so years. He did one of the very first tours that we ever did with Blue and Gray, and we have stayed close and joined in history and in other areas for a lot of years. And so it's a real pleasure to sit down and talk with him tonight. And you probably picked up a little stuff of what we're going to be talking about tonight and the importance of it. Gordon has just completed a wonderful new book that is going to be published in November by LSU Press. And I just had the opportunity to read it, as did Jim McPherson, Gary Gallagher, Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, and others, about a gentleman whom most people probably haven't heard a whole heck of a lot about, and we're going to talk about that tonight. This is a little different than what we have been doing. Of course, this, I think, is 25th or 26th lecture that we have, or interview that we've done. These all go up on YouTube, and that is a free site. All you need is an account to view these often. And I encourage you to tell your friends to go and sign up on the Blue and Gray YouTube site as well. And I think we've got 220 or so people are there now. And you can watch all these going all the way back to January. This is our second book interview. We did one with Bob Plum much earlier in the year when I had a gap in that, and then my good friend Kent Masterson Brown is also has a new book out on Meade and Command at Gettysburg, of which I'm finishing that, and he and I are going to have a discussion next Wednesday. But what you will find there, when you go to Blue and Gray's YouTube, 200 and is that 299? No, 239. You'll see all the different interviews that we've done here. Everyone is free. Watch it as often as you'd like to. Some have had more than 1,000 viewings. Others have had 20 viewings. They all contribute something, I think, and I think that you'll enjoy that. So I do encourage you to go. If you don't have a YouTube account, I encourage you to go get one and sign up and subscribe to Blue and Gray. The other thing that you will see if you go to our website, and that's something that is just reserved for our active members, since it deals with people's intellectual property, is we have been digitizing and putting in our archives more than 200 lectures from the past 28 years, mostly over the first 10 to 15 years of Blue and Gray's existence. And Karen Needles, who is our host tonight, has been doing this work for us for about a year now, a little over a year. And when we finish this, we'll have between 350 and 400 lectures from different Blue and Gray programs. One of them, you see Andy Trudeau there. He's the next one. I think it pops up here. Yeah, that was the first time that Gordon Rhea spoke to us, was at that program, and that we have Gordon's talk as well as Andy's and Joe Glathar's and people like that. So a really neat opportunity for you if you're an active member of Blue and Gray. If you were a member of Blue and Gray and have gone past due, you can rejoin Blue and Gray and get your own access to this and enjoy literally hundreds of hours of lectures from well over 100 different historians, including Ed Bars and others like that. So with that, I have one other thing that I want to mention, and then we'll get started. But we live in strange times right now, as you're well aware, and it seems like we're always taking, with COVID, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. It's still affecting our tours and stuff. We have been running a fundraiser that's going to end on the 31st. If you haven't had the opportunity or considered making a donation to it, let me know. Our goal was to raise $25,000 to offset the impact of cancellations, late cancellations on our tours. For example, we had one program 2 weeks ago on Grierson's Raid that was going to be about 15 people, and COVID-D came out and we dropped down to 6 or 7 people, but still did the tour. And in another instance, we've got one coming up in Winchester that had 10 people and we're down to 4 people because of COVID-D, but the people who are coming from across the country, and I feel like we need to go ahead and conduct these programs for them. So I would hope that you would support that if you have the ability, and hopefully we'll get back to normal here pretty soon. The last thing that you've been looking, and Karen kind of flipped through it quickly, is if you don't know about the Lincoln Archives Digital Project, go look at it. Karen has been doing this for 20 plus years. Her intention is to digitize all the records of the Lincoln administration, all 11 million of them or so. She's been doing it 20 years. I have been encouraging her. She has a couple of 100,000 done. My belief is that she will finish this in approximately 173 years. But the work that she has put up there is endlessly fascinating. Take a look at it. And while she's not a nonprofit organization, she certainly lives the role of a nonprofit. So if you have some shekels and you like what she's doing, I strongly encourage you to make a donation there. It will help pay the light bills and replace the busted out rear window in her car. So,
well, she's a warriorette. She takes a licking and keeps on ticking. So
that is a fact. Okay, well, let's get it going then. And thanks, Karen. We'll talk with you later. And good evening, Gordon. How you doing tonight?
Doing great, Lynn. What's up?
Well, I just, as we have been talking about, I just finished one of the real pleasures of the past year, and that was reading your new book on Stephen Swails, a very, very interesting character, whom I would dare say 90% of the people on this call probably have never heard his name before. But we're all gonna know a lot more about Mr. Swales by the time we're finished. And okay. I'm delighted that you've written this book, which is going to be out in November. Yes, and I hope that it will generate some questions and also some good discussions. So with that, what I'd like to open with is tell us a little something about what makes the 54th and 55th Massachusetts special and unique among Black regiments.
Well, they were very unusual among Black regiments. Earlier in the war, particularly in 1862, some regiments had been begun, made up of freed slaves in Georgia, South Carolina. They weren't actually admitted as full regiments to the Federal Army until obviously again to 1863. But the 54th Massachusetts was unique. It was raised in the Boston area. That was where it was set up. And the governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, was a moving force behind it. He's quite a character, and I spent some time in my book talking about him, but a strong abolitionist, and felt that it would be productive to have regiments that were built of free Black citizens. And he actually started the 54th Massachusetts. He got permission to do that early in 1863 from Secretary of War Staunton. And by spring, the recruiting was already taking place. It's unusual in that it was drawn predominantly from free blacks, and most of whom had not even ever experienced slavery. This is raised in the North, predominantly in New England, some from the Midwest, some from other parts of the country, but predominantly New England area. And Stephen Swales, the figure of my biography that I've just finished, was one of those free blacks who joined the 54th Massachusetts in April of 1863. And this regiment would obviously fight in major battles, and we walk through all of those whenever you'd like to do that. But in
Sure.
South Carolina and Florida, whatever, distinguished itself tremendously. And Swales actually becomes the first African American to be commissioned as an officer in a combat context in the U.S. military ever. At the end of the war, he decides to stay in the South and stay in South Carolina. He marries a free black in South Carolina, ends up working with the Freedmen's Bureau, and becomes very popular in the area that he worked at, an area around the town of Kingstree, and gets elected to the South Carolina Senate and actually becomes a speaker pro tempore of the South Carolina Senate, which is the most important figure in that Senate. Does a lot to advance some of the progressive legislation during Reconstruction. And then ultimately, in the mid to late 1870s, when Reconstruction ends, and he's driven out of town by the Red Shirts, by some of Wade Hampton's boys, and by the Ku Klux Klan. But continues to return to South Carolina for pretty much for the rest of his life, taking part as much as he can in politics, even though his life is in tremendous danger doing that. So I found him a fascinating character for several reasons, which we can talk about as well. One of them is that he was well educated, having grown up as a free man in the North, wrote, and his papers were preserved. And so he's one of the very few African American soldiers whose papers we have and we can work with as historians. There's also a lot about him in the South Carolina archives for his time in the South Carolina Senate. And of course, there's a good bit about him in the National Archives as well for his time with the Freedmen's Bureau. So he's a person who goes through all of these transitions, all of these different periods, the pre-Civil War, the Civil War itself, and Reconstruction, and is a major player who has been basically lost to time. And when I came into possession of these papers, which is a fascinating story as well, I knew I'd hit a gold mine.
You know, the thing that is fascinating, and I was going to read your book because you had written it, because I've known you for a long time. But what really got me intrigued by the subject and the individual was when you go back and you think about the huge impact that the Dred Scott decision had on the country, on the mood of the country and so forth. What I've always thought was lost in that discussion until you came out with this book was that all the focus had always been on slavery, slaves, people who were not free, and people who were not citizens or could not be citizens, or that had, quote, no rights that a white man was obliged to respect. And so the society and even the war unfolds with these non-people kind of on the tangent of society going on. And yet there are people like Swales, Frederick Douglass, others whom have lived a very robust life in the freed states of America, whom are profoundly affected by this. And to find that Lincoln was willing to take and move ostensibly what was a white man's fight against other white people and move people of color into the army in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation and so forth, really opened up a whole new network for people to look at. And when you sit down and you look then at the 54th composed of free people, juxtaposed with, say, the 1st South Carolina or the 2nd South Carolina, 4th South Carolina, that are all slaves, it really makes for compelling thinking and introspection. When the 54th comes into the Army, is mustered in, and is sent south and sent down to Port Royal, one of the first things that they are offered the opportunity to do is accompany federal soldiers, federal black soldiers, the 1st South Carolina and so forth, on a raid down along the Georgia coast to a town named Darien. What happens between the members of the 54th, the black members of the 54th, and the white officers of South Carolina and the former slaves that compose the South Carolinians? How does that interface play out?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. I delve into what happened there at Darien a bit. A gentleman by the name of James Montgomery actually put together this raid, and he was commander of one of the black South Carolina regiments, federal regiments in South Carolina, that had been raised predominantly or virtually, I think, solely from former slaves who were just recently freed. The 54th was in large part joined them for a raid on a city just up a small river in Georgia by the name of Darien. And Darien itself was not much of a town, small little place. It was mainly a center where produce from the interior would be sent out to the sea and then transported. And so this was one of the many raids on the basically the inland points of distribution of the South that was being carried on in this area. And the 54th Massachusetts was commanded by Robert Gould Shaw, who was from Massachusetts. He was a white man, very well respected, and a very strong abolitionist himself. And he'd fought in the war, had been wounded at Antietam, had quite a war history and background. The 54th was sent up the river along with one of the other regiments. And basically Montgomery has the artillery shell some houses along the way. And the men of the 54th start to get disturbed about this. I mean, we didn't come along here to blow up people's houses. They get to Darien, and Montgomery basically attacks the town, which is undefended, has most of the town burned to the ground. He himself lights one of the houses on fire, and has the 54th take a big hand in this. Shaw is completely against it, the commander of the 54th, but feels that he has no choice. He has to obey orders. And fortunately, he wrote prolifically to his former girlfriend and at that point wife. And so we have his letters. And he wrote immediately after this, explaining what had happened and saying, you know, this is horribly embarrassing. I would never want to have anything to do with this. Colonel Montgomery says that we have to destroy the property of the slaveholders. It will be the hands of God. I don't want to be a hand of God. That's not what I'm all about. This is what I mean by warfare against innocent civilians. And the other thing he was really worried about is what's this going to do to the reputation of the 54th Massachusetts, of these black soldiers. And I quote what some of the Southern newspapers were putting out very shortly afterwards, and that is that this proved that the black man was a savage, that they're attacking civilians, that they were burning down homes and villages for no good purpose. And so the 54th Massachusetts and Shaw really took it on as their burden to prove that they weren't like that and to prove that they were fantastic soldiers, which is exactly what happened and what they did by the time they got to Battery Wagner here at Charleston.
And that's exactly a great segue into Battery Wagner, because there is certainly a lot of issues of character and human dignity, I think, involved in the assimilation of men who were free, who were not paid the same as the white soldiers, who are respectful and wanting to fight, not burn, but wanting to actually fight for their freedom. And you know, I think everybody knows the story of Glory. So let's just focus on Swales in the Battery Wagner assault. because I think that certainly opens the door for him.
Yeah, it does. It does in many ways. Swales was, as I mentioned, a black man. We know a little bit about his mother and father, but mainly just from census records. His father apparently was, as often described as mulatto or black, apparently had escaped from slavery in Maryland, and his mother was either a white lady or a mulatto. And again, it's not all that totally clear. But Swales was very light-skinned and actually often could pass for white. And that was one comment that was made, and will be one big comment noticed by the War Department when they decided to commission him as an officer. But to get back to our story about Battery Wagner, shortly after Swales joined the 54th Massachusetts, he was made a sergeant. He was talented. He was smart. He was 31 years old, so he had some time behind him. Well educated, and he looked white, and this was something that was very important to his superiors, and they wrote about it that way. He, as the regiment is being set up to lead the attack at Battery Wagner, he will play a big part in this, and I'm sure most people here have seen the movie Glory. The Battery Wagner story is a fascinating one. The big mission was to take Charleston, which obviously was the seat of the rebellion and a major Confederate seaport. Fort Sumter was in the middle of the Charleston harbor, and on either side of it were other forts. Fort Moultrie on one side, and then on the other side, Fort Johnson, and then this little island called Morris Island that had two batteries on it, Battery Gregg and Battery Wagner. Battery Wagner was really a massive fortress, and the decision was made by the Union commanders: we can take Battery Wagner, that will open the key to Charleston, because then we can easily bombard Sumter, bombard Charleston. We'll be in like Flint. Well, but it was going to be hard to do because there was a long beach that led up to Battery Wagner and had ocean on one side, marsh on the other side, and so attacking troops would basically funnel down this beach.
Sure.
It would end up on a very narrow front. The battery itself had fortifications in front, had a big ditch that would fill with water, and then big high walls, and it was made of dirt, made of felled trees, and it was tough, and it was very, very well manned. Well, the decision was made to attack it. It was bombarded heavily by Union warships from the sea and ironclads, and the decision was made to go ahead and launch the attack. And the question became, well, who is going to lead this attack? And the 54th Massachusetts was chosen to lead the attack. The general that made that decision, there's some real dispute about why he decided to put them in front. They had, in a smaller engagement a few days before, distinguished themselves quite well, a little battle up on James Island. But they weren't as well known as the other regiments. And also there was some trepidation in putting sort of greenhorn black soldiers at the front. It was politically, it could raise issues. And then again, they just hadn't been in that much combat. The decision was made to put them in, according to one reporter who passed by the generals as they were talking about it. This reporter wrote that he overheard conversations where the lead general was saying, well, let's put in the 54th first. We got to get rid of them niggers somehow. And basically, words to that effect. Sooner or later, we got to get rid of them. Let's do it now. That general later denied having said any such thing and said that he'd actually put them in because they were, he believed in them. They'd proven themselves well in an earlier smaller engagement, and he was going to give them a chance. So we'll really never know, but they begin their real big part of the career here with yet another dispute. The attack is prepared to be made. The soldiers are lying there. It's almost near dark, and there's all of the accounts of how the men were writing out little letters to their family and putting them in their pockets and giving their addresses to their other friends in case they get killed, so they would survive. The order to go forward is called out, and the regiment moves forward, actually leads the attack. The Confederate entrenchments light up with fire. The attack continues. Massive losses, but the 54th, led by Colonel Shaw, crashes into the head of Battery Wagner, and Shaw and others go up onto the earthworks, onto the battlements. Shaw is killed very early on. Swales survives. He ends up on top of some of those battlements. He's with two other captains who are up there. Himself, still a sergeant, and he's up there with two of the white captains. All of the officers, by the way, at this point, all the commissioned officers are white, and that was a given. White officers, black soldiers, and black non-commissioned officers. In any event, Swales ends up basically trying to save the life of those two officers. He leaves a detailed account of it. I recount that in the book. Bottom line is he's unable to save either one of them, but hangs on and is one of the last men to finally abandon the entrenchment. So that's the beginning of his name, about how people started to really talk about Swales. Now he wasn't just an unknown quantity. It's clear this is a man who could lead troops, who wasn't afraid to get involved in combat, and who could really perform some powerful acts of bravery.
You know, what's fascinating, we understand that the United States government didn't want to commission black soldiers. Jim Hollingsworth, when he was doing his research on the Louisiana Native Guards many years ago, and produced the book that I think also LSU Press published, and they ran into difficulties there as well, in which the Creoles, who were men of color, who had led the Louisiana units there, the Native Guards, they wanted to commission them, and the South would not allow them to be commissioned because of their dark pigmentation. Mm-hmm. And even going to Petersburg and elsewhere, regardless, you get the sense that the general may have denied it, but it bears the air of truth. You know, they were, quote, niggers, unquote. They needed to be disposed of, and no white man had to respect them or their rights. And so the question comes forward, why do people go so hard and go to the mat to get a commission for Swales?
Right. It's interesting. Swales continues to distinguish himself tremendously at the Battle of Olustee in North Florida. Again, I won't go into the details of that here, but he gets wounded in the head badly, but he is a major figure. He's trying to rally his troops. He's trying basically to put up a rear guard as the rest of the Union force is retreating, and is very highly regarded by his superiors. The colonel of the regiment actually writes a commendation for him, and in the report of the battle mentions him by name and says, even though wounded, not mortally, but badly wounded in the head, he did such a spectacular job. And it was his colonel who also then went ahead and pushed for him to be commissioned. The governor of Massachusetts, Governor Andrew, also pushed for him to actually be commissioned. And it's interesting, I brought with me, copied down some of the words that they were using. The War Department initially declined to commission him. And they said, because of, quote, Swales's color, he being partially of African blood. And the War Department, the Secretary of War actually wrote that it was contrary to public policy to receive persons of African descent into the service as commissioned officers. So there was no question about why he wasn't going to be commissioned. His Colonel Hollowell, who had followed after the battle and there in South Carolina, wrote more and finally wrote and said, Sergeant Swales is not yet mustered as an officer because he is believed to have African blood in him. How can we hope for success to our arms or God's blessing in any shape while we as a nation are so blind to justice? Swales is then given leave. He goes up to Washington and apparently personally lobbies the War Department, goes in there and talks with them. And finally, he gets a fantastic letter from General Foster, who was heading that whole department during that period of the war. And he wrote, Sergeant Swales is so nearly white that it would be difficult to discover any trace of his African blood. He is so intelligent and of such good character that after a fair trial, I now recommend his being allowed to serve as a commissioned officer. And so he was. And I think it was all of those factors that brought it around, and a whole lot of people fighting for Swales to get him there. The Captain Emilio, who ultimately wrote the history of the 54th Massachusetts and who was a captain in the regiment, later wrote about that incident. He said, "This decision, persistently solicited and finally granted, must rank high with the moral victories wrung from the general government by the regiment and its founders." So everyone in the regiment was excited about the fact that one of their own had become really the first African-American to be commissioned as an officer in a combat setting. In all fairness, there had been some commissioned as ministers and in the health and medical area, but none in a combat role. And the big concern also was that the African-American officers may end up having to command white soldiers, and that would definitely be a problem. So.
You mentioned Emilio's fine book on the 54th, and
right.
The operative word in what you were quoting was moral.
Right.
And that really is where I think your book is so important, and really I couldn't give it a higher recommendation that people should read it, because it opens up a door, because the war ends. The war is going to end in another year and a half or so. Appomattox will come, Bennett Place will come, and the South is out of the Union, and all these former states all have to be governed, and they have to be handled. And in addition to that, now the ramifications of the Emancipation Proclamation have to be dealt with. The distribution of acreage, the transition of people into becoming productive citizens of the United States. There's still legislation that has to be sorted out. So how does he end up in South Carolina?
Well, actually, by the end of the war, he's pretty much a war hero in many ways. And it's one other thing I want to mention about his service there during the war that I found fascinating, and that fits into the same theme you've been asking me about. And that is this: the African-American soldiers, when they volunteered for the 54th Massachusetts, had been promised they would be paid the same as white soldiers. They were to get $13 a month. They didn't get it. And after 5 months of never being paid, they were getting very upset. So they, the authorities came down from Washington to talk to them and said, basically, we'll give you $10 a month, and then we will subtract $3 a month for basically housing allowance, and so you'll get $7 a month. Well, their response was basically, no, we've gone 5 months without anything. We'll just not take anything until you give us what we were promised, which is $13 a month. A black man's life is worth what a white man's life is like. We lie in the same graves. The same dirt is thrown on us. Why should we be paid anything different? There's some very, very strong things were written. Swales became a leader of that movement. He was very active he actually wrote the president and others, threatening to resign if he and his men weren't treated the same way that the white soldiers and officers were. And it ultimately worked. He ended up, he and all the other members of the 54th and all other black regimental officers and soldiers ended up receiving the pay of the white counterparts. It took virtually till the end of the war, but it did finally come down. So in many ways, he was a major mover within that 54th regiment. That's the kind of guy that he was. He fell in love there during the last months of the war with a young lady, Susan Aspinall, from Charleston, South Carolina. She was a black, but from a free black family in Charleston. There were some of those, not many, but a few. They were married, and he decided to stay there in South Carolina and join what was known as the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau had its origins basically during the war. It changed names and functions a few different times, but its purpose was to help this massive volume of freed slaves to get housing, to get work and jobs, to see that their contracts were fairly enforced, a whole range of things. It was a massive, massive service program, basically to help this whole transition. He became involved with the Freedmen's Bureau and ultimately got assigned to a place called Kingstree, South Carolina, which is an interior city in South Carolina. It's close to 100 miles from Charleston, sort of northeast as you go up. I'm sorry, almost due north actually as you go into the state. He was very good there at the Freedmen's Bureau, and I include in my book several of the letters and documents that he wrote, and was basically stood up for the rights of the freed slaves, but at the same time was very fair to their white counterparts, and pretty much won support from both factions. So when ultimately you could vote, when Black people were given the right to vote across the country during the Reconstruction period, he ran for office in Kingstree and was elected to the South Carolina Senate. He also was elected to a body that was drawing a new South Carolina Constitution, and he was extremely active in that as well, one of the major figures. Didn't give many speeches, but was very good working behind the scenes, getting people to come together. This was a smart guy. He then became a major figure in Kingstree. He didn't let grass grow under his feet. He was elected mayor. He handled a lot of other affairs, business affairs there in the city. He decided he wanted to be a lawyer, so he studied law and passed the South Carolina bar, became a lawyer, and took as a law partner a white lawyer who had actually fought in the Confederate armies in one of the battles against Swales. And they set up their own office there in Kingstree. So here is a guy who is really working all sides. It's an astounding trait, but not careful not to offend people, but also taking good, strong, hard positions. And he becomes a major figure in Reconstruction in South Carolina.
You know, it's fascinating. And again, earlier in the conversation, we talked about the composition of the 54th. And, you know, leadership comes often from within their own pods of people. I mean, it's not necessarily that people need to be segregated into different piles and then the leaders come from those, but rather people who had been freed and who lived in the North, whether you were colored or white, if you had an education, if you were literate, the world at that time could and should be your oyster. And when you get into a situation that I think we've all found ourselves in before, in which you see that you can do so much good when you're in some place. I mean, Swales finds himself, he's a soldier. He very easily could have mustered out. He could have gone back home. He could have parlayed his commission and other things and did very well for himself. And yet, in the midst of all this turbulence and turmoil, he elects to take on another leadership role,
right? And
to help other people, not so much for his own benefit, although there are issues, and you raise them, in which people, as often happens in politics, he suffered a lot of ad hominem attacks as people tried to discredit his effectiveness and tried to reduce his clout within the Kingstree area and in Columbia itself. Would you like to address some of that?
Well, we often think of politics today as being kind of nasty and hard hitting. You should read some of the newspaper accounts that were coming out in the late 1860s and into the 1870s in, say, South Carolina, where I immersed myself in those things. It was rough. Most papers were against Black populace being able to vote or have any part in government, and the constant message there is that they're all corrupt, they're all incompetent, they don't know what they're doing. Usually filled with ad hominem attacks and some extraordinarily racial comparisons, and I won't go into all of that. I do take a look at some of that in the book, and the pro African American newspapers, even though there weren't near as many, were often extraordinarily defensive, and so the battles were getting fought on pretty rough grounds. Swales stayed out of that. You don't ever see him calling other people names or anything like that. He stays above the fray and tries to always keep it issue oriented, which is amazing. It became harder and harder to do, though, because in the 1867, 1868, the Ku Klux Klan becomes active. And suddenly a lot of black leaders in South Carolina are being assassinated. And I go through all of that. And it becomes dangerous to be a black politician. Swales doesn't blink. He stays right there in the limelight, and rolls with it. And he does make some comments about how, you know, he's taken his life in his hands, and that he understands that. But it's a frightening time. But in my mind, to see someone like that who can stand up for principle is impressive. He also was accused on different occasions of having been involved in some bribery and having taken some kickbacks from some various business ventures mainly in the King Street area. And again, he denied it. No charges were ever brought against him, and we'll just quite honestly never know to what extent he might have been involved in some skimming or not. Those were very corrupt times. And a lot of the people that he was associated with, including some of the governors even, were thrown out of office for corruption. And there were a lot of charges that were brought as well. He was never charged with anything. And to me, since most of the courts and prosecutors were of the opposite party and were white, the fact that they never put together and brought charges against him indicates that it may well have been that the claims of corruption that were made against him were purely political, and there really was no factual foundation for them. But that's all I can really say about it. We will probably never know.
You know, it's interesting. Mike Hoover asked if Swales ever served in the United States Congress, and I believe
No.
he did not. He just but he was active within the South Carolina legislature, and of course,
Right.
you are from, or you live in South Carolina. I've lived in South Carolina a lot of years, and you have a strong sense. I know that you've done a lot of look-see at what went on in South Carolina. Certainly, the heart of the rebellion and the Southern view of things.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about the disruption to the Southern society, the South Carolina society, and the white response to not only the disruption to their society, but also to the advancement of people like Swales and government agencies coming in to their state and directing them to do things.
Yeah, it was fierce, as you might imagine. And it was total wide open. I wrote several articles over the past years looking at the issue of why white Southerners who were not slave owners fought in the Civil War and what were their attitudes and that sort of thing. And when I put those articles together, what I decided I would do was look to what the people who were forming public opinion were saying. And it seemed to me that during this time frame of the 1850s into the 1860s, et cetera, churches were a mainstay of Southern society, particularly in South Carolina. And so I'd spent a lot of time looking at sermons and what preachers were saying about Black people, about slavery, about abolitionism. And I also looked at what the political figures were saying, and then at a lot of the community leaders who weren't necessarily political, but were the big landowners or whatever, and what messages they were putting out. And I won't bore you with all of them, but the general tenor was, leading up to the war, that slavery is ordained by the Bible. It's ordained by the Creator. And it's an essential element of our society. And even the prophets of the Bible had slaves, and there were a lot of quotations that were then marked, and that to be anti-slavery would be to be anti-God. And what we need to do is basically cut off the withered hand. In other words, secede from the North. And it's a strong message. And there was also a lot talked about Black people. And for instance, I just had one quote here I can read to you from one of the top Southern ministers in South Carolina. He said, who, without indignation and horror, could contemplate the triumph of Negro equality and see his own sons and daughters in the not distant future associating with free Negroes upon terms of political and equal and social equality. If slaves were freed, the Black race will be in a large majority, and then we will have Black governors, Black legislators, Black jurors, Black everything. Is it supposed that the white race will stand for that? It's not a supposable case. And another one went on and said that war would break out everywhere like hidden fire from the earth if the Blacks were freed. We will be overpowered and our men will be compelled to wander like vagabonds all over the earth. And as for our women, the horrors of their state we cannot contemplate in imagination. We will be completely exterminated, and the land will be left in the possession of the Blacks, and then it will go back to a wilderness and become another Africa or Santo Domingo, which was Haiti.
Sure, sure.
And also John Townsend, who was one of the major cotton plantation owners in Edisto Island, South Carolina, wrote several pamphlets. And what he said, I thought seemed to sum up what I was seeing in a lot of the writing. And that is, what about people who don't even own slaves but are white? And he said this. He said, the turning loose upon society without the salutary restraints to which they are now accustomed, more than 4 millions of a very poor and ignorant population to ramble in idleness over the country until their wants should drive most of them first to petty thefts and afterwards to the bolder crimes of robbery and murder cannot be condoned. It will be to the non-slaveholder, equally with the largest slaveholder, the obliteration of caste and the deprivation of important privileges. The color of the white man is now, in the South, a title of nobility in his relations as to the Negro. In the Southern slaveholding states, where menial and degrading offices are turned over to be performed exclusively by the Negro slave, the status and color of the Black race becomes the badge of inferiority. And the poorest non-slaveholder may rejoice with the richest of his brethren of the white race in the distinction of his color. He may be poor, it is true, but there is no point upon which he is so justly proud and sensitive as his privilege of caste, and there is nothing which he would resent with more fierce indignation than the attempt of the abolitionist to emancipate the slaves and elevate the Negroes to an equality with himself and his family. Those are just a few examples. I can tell you they're very symptomatic of exactly what was being said, and that's what Southerners were hearing from all of the different institutions that they respected. And that's the kind of culture that Swales steps into.
You know, it's fascinating because it's not just a Southern phenomenon. As you remember, argument over amalgamation in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, in which both Lincoln and Douglas were put in a position of having to explain and then backtrack that they were in favor, that each was in favor of amalgamation and the mixing of the races and so forth. And they had to stand up. Lincoln is quoted famously as saying, "It has been represented that I'm in favor of equality. I'm not. If there's to be a superior position, I, for one, am in favor of the white man holding the superior position and the Black man holding the inferior position." I mean, that's in Illinois in 1858.
Yeah.
And
Swales ran against that very same problem as he was growing up. He grew up in Pennsylvania, and there were race riots all around him, which he experienced. I write a good bit about those because he was right in the middle of some of them innocently as a child. And he experienced the same thing all the way up. And believe it or not, as the 54th Massachusetts was leaving Boston, marching out of town and getting onto the ships to go down to the battlefront, they marched by some of the big homes and clubs, and people would pull the blinds so they wouldn't have to look at the Black man walking by. And one of the main newspapers there in Boston the next day described what was going on and said there will be no need for the Union people to have scouts, because with 20,000 or 2,000 Black soldiers, they'll be able to smell them from 20 miles away. Those are the kind of attitudes that they faced in the North as well, and violence, and which came forth, of course, in the New York draft riots, all of that, which in
Well, you
fair
know,
participation.
what's fascinating is and then it leads to what I really want to kind of culminate this thing towards is you start to move into the power and strength of the leaders of society. Nobody more powerful or legendary in South Carolina history than Wade Hampton and his period known as the redemption period. Clearly the redemption of the white race and the other things that are going on in an effort to reestablish through any means possible the control of the society that they enjoyed before the war and before all this had been unleashed on them.
Right.
Doesn't Swales suffer as when in his work as he moves from being a member of the Freedmen's Bureau and becomes an integral part of South Carolina politics? Doesn't he experience an attempt on his life or his family's lives? And does that threat? What does that threat do to Swales in his political career?
Yeah, it all comes to a head, and Swales is giving a talk at a church a few miles north of King Street, and suddenly some people sort of break in and start to interrupt the ceremony, and he well, not the ceremony, the political event that's going on, and he recognizes them as some of his political opponents from King Street. They're thrown out, but ultimately he leaves and goes back to King Street with his some of his family and some of his supporters. They are then headed off by a armed contingent of these interlopers, and they're forced to basically follow along behind this armed contingent into town. Swales says, "Am I under arrest, or am I, what's going on here?" And they say, "Yes, you're in our control." And then he tries to make a break for it and dodge into the courthouse there in the central part of King Street. There's some shots that ring out. Some of his supporters are shot, and some of the people who had obviously broken up that meeting are identified as shooters. He manages to escape with his life, but then not that much longer afterwards, they come to his house and deliver him basically a manifesto, and they're able to get a copy of its contents, and basically tell him that if he's not gone within 10 days, he'll be dead. And he goes down to Charleston, does a little bit of business, comes back. He's met at the train station by several of his friends who say these people are serious. And so he goes up to Washington, and he doesn't live full time in King Street again. He basically gives that up, gets a job up there in Washington, working with the bureaucracy through some of his contacts.
What struck me in the wrap up of the book, and as it tied itself together, it really opened my mind, Gordon. It was an element of understanding what we had become as a country by 1870, 1880, and so forth. And we talk about the Gilded Age. We talk about all the opportunities that came forward to allow people to become wealthy, the success of so many soldiers who had fought in the war, then went on to found businesses and do things they had to do. And yet you see these things that just life went on, and people who disrupted the status quo were marginalized to the extent that they were able to marginalize them. And eventually, by the end of the 19th century, you have separate but equal. You have this return basically to a completely segregated society in which the freed blacks have been marginalized again and forced into their own cupboards, not to mix with white people, right, and to do this sort of stuff. And that, in the midst of everything the country has gone through recently, I was very impressed with the reviewers of your book to notice that that a very prominent Black man in the United States thought enough of your book to take the time to read it and to comment on it. And that's James Clyburn, the majority whip in the House of Representatives. Could you tell us a little something about finding the papers, and then how did it that your book ended up in front of McPherson, Gallagher, and James Clyburn?
Well, finding the papers was an interesting story. The probably as interesting as Swales' life itself. Back in, I think it was 1978, there were two young boys, two young men in their pickup truck there in King Street, South Carolina, driving along, and they go by a spot where the land's being cleared. There's some construction taking place, and they see this old trunk sitting there, and keep driving on, and then get curious and sort of drive back to see what it was, and it's gone. The garbage people picked it up. Later that day, one of those young men was driving by the city dump on his way out toward the local river to do some fishing. And he sees the trunk lying there, and he runs over. It's getting ready for destruction, but it hadn't been destroyed yet. And he runs over, takes a peek inside, and he sees it's got a bunch of old papers. And here's a letter to Wade Hampton. He knew that name, former governor of South Carolina, of course, major Confederate general. And he figures, maybe this is worth something. So he takes it home, and he and his brother comb through it, and they're bringing it to the local historical society, where the head of the society gives them $75 for the papers, and and they end up being saved. Well, it turns out those papers were Swales's personal papers that he had kept, not only his military records, but a lot of his notes about some of these battles and things that had happened to him, letters to various political figures, a lot of stuff, tons of stuff. And through a series of strange events, they were preserved for posterity. The area, by the way, where they were found is where his home had been. So the home had been demolished, and that had been in the attic or heaven knows where, and ended up saved. So there was a local attorney by the name of Billy Jenkinson in Kingstree who got very interested in Kingstree history, learned about Swales, became fascinated with him, and actually put together a monument, a roadside marker. There was a ceremony at it there in Kingstree marking where Swales' house had been, and then later actually put together a big event at Swales' burial place there. He was buried in Charleston in near Magnolia Cemetery, and Billy Jenkinson had a monument put up to Swales there. He was interested in getting a book out about Swales. Billy's a good lawyer, but he didn't view himself as much of a writer, but he'd read some of my stuff, and I had done an earlier biography of a Confederate from Charleston in a book called Carrying the Flag.
Yeah, Wilden, yeah.
Yeah, the Wilden book. And his brother knew my wife, and she needed something done in Kingstree of a legal sort, and his brother recommended him to her, and he told her, well, yeah, I'd be glad to help you out, but you got to get me an interview with your husband. And so Billy and I got together, and he brought me all those papers. I took a look at them, and it's utterly fascinating. There's virtually no books out about individual Black soldiers. There were 200,000 of them, and that's what got me interested in this. And I've been digging into it for years. The COVID epidemic gave me some free time from my usual practice of law, so I was able to sit down for a year and really put it all together, and it was exciting. And I was honored to have McPherson and Gallagher and all of those folks write me nice blurbs, as well as a good one from Jim Clyburn. I wanted to go beyond the simple academic group that does blurbs, Civil War historians, whatever, and try to reach out to other folks who have a much wider constituency. I think it's a story that says a lot about America. It says some hard things about America, but also some very positive things about America. And there's one thing that I sort of end the book with. I just like to throw out to you. I see our time's about up.
Please.
But there was a monument that was erected to the 54th New York there in Boston. And Swales actually went up and took part in the ceremony. It was in 1897. He took part in the ceremony for the dedication of that memorial. In 1997, for the 100th anniversary, Adam Clayton Powell was brought in for the rededication. And of course, he was, as you know, very big in American military service. He led the, U.S. military. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of
Colin
Staff.
Powell, not Adam Clayton, Colin Powell.
I said Adam Clayton. I'm sorry. I
You
mean,
did.
Colin
You're talking
Powell.
about that corrupt politician.
I'm sorry. My brain is, I'm up here in Maine, so my brain's all fuzzed up.
Too much lobster.
Too much lobster. Colin Powell. Anyway, Colin Powell said this in talking about the 54th Massachusetts and the some 200,000 African Americans who actually served in the military during the Civil War. He said, as a result of their service, they had helped preserve the Union and moved us one step closer to equality. But even with the 13th and 14th Amendments, we still didn't get all the blessings of liberty or what had been earned by the service of Black men. The cumulative efforts of those who came before me, however, brought considerable progress. I stand before you as a direct descendant of every one of those Negroes. I was able to rise to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior military position in the armed forces of the United States, but I have a direct lineage back to the men of the 54th. So that was Colin Powell's thoughts about the 54th Massachusetts. And it was men obviously like Stephen Swails who made that regiment what it was.
Well, what a great way to finish. We had a really fine chat. I hope some people who checked in early had a chance to enjoy some of that conversation as well. It's always a pleasure exchanging thoughts with you, Gordon, and I feel really blessed and to have enjoy your confidence and enjoy your trust and letting me see the book before it's published. And what you have done is really important. Frankly, what this man did was very important. And if we are to get anything from our studies of the Civil War and so forth, I think it's really critical that we look at that period. Other than reading Andrew's book on Wade Hampton's Southern Redeemer,
right,
we have to read Swales' book as well, because there are, in fact, two sides to the story in South Carolina, Georgia, Indiana, New York, elsewhere,
exactly,
as we have gone this road. So somebody asked, and off the top of my head, I can't think it, title of the book.
Well, I have the uncorrected page proof version of it here. Let me see if you can see that. It's got a picture of Swales, by the way, there on the front. And it's called Stephen A. Swales, Black Freedom Fighter in the Civil War and Reconstruction. There's the full net title of it. It's on. You can go on Amazon or those. They're all up for pre.
Yeah, you can pre-sell it, and as I mentioned to you, with your courtesy, we'll offer this as a Christmas opportunity for people to get it when it comes out, and I will use your pen and ask if you would sign it for our folks, and
I'd be glad
we'll
to
get the thing out too. So
I'd be glad to, and I'll even lobby LSU Press and see if they'll give you all the break on the price. They don't give us authors much of anything, but that's fine. I do it because I love the work. But I strongly support your organization. I think, as you know, we've worked together for many, many years. So,
well, I certainly appreciate it. As always, Gordon, just a delight to be with you. I look forward to us getting together in October and doing the first half of the Overland campaign. Should be a good program, busload of folks.
Yeah,
we'll have a good time.
We'll do Wilderness in Spotsylvania.
Yep. And then we got a program, the second half of it, the first part of next year. So we're going to have some time together. I look forward to it.
Same here.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. And all you who joined us tonight, thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Okay.